It was the king's uncle, John of Gaunt, who had imposed the first poll tax, to pay for the 100 Years' War with the poor's pennies and pounds. But the tax would also benefit Gaunt, worth £100 million in today's money, so the rebels burnt his Savoy palace to the ground. Gaunt's palace was built with the proceeds of the plunder that he'd carried out in Poitiers and Crécy. He spent £35,000 on it, then the equivalent of a third of the wages bill for the entire English army. Records from the Court of King's Bench show that this raid was led by a woman, Joanna Farrur. She was named as the chief perpetrator and leader, riding on horseback with improvised armour. John of Gaunt was away, but his stuffed jerkin was made a target, to be filled with arrows by Joanna and the rebel crowd. Then Joanna uncovered a treasure chest filled with coins. With a sovereign per person, she saw it equally shared. Barrels of gunpowder Gaunt kept there were ignited, and London's most lavish building was left in ruins. Burning for a week, Joanna's smoking rubble pointed to the transience of a rich man's power and influence. After Newgate jail was stormed and prisoners were released, the Fleet Prison's governor was pricked with a sabre, followed by the Lord Chancellor and the Inns of Court lawyers, whose privileges rested on taxes and forced labour. Bundles of documents that legitimized the serfs' shackles by couching them in legalese were seized and liberated from frightened lawyers scuttling like rats in the temple chambers. Their papers were hurled onto bonfires, then incinerated. The Chief Justice, John Cavendish, tried to escape by boat, but he was spotted by 3 women, Catherine Gayman, Margaret Wright, and Margaret Drinkenar, who dispensed their own rough justice when they caught him. The King's Bench prison was sprung, and Richard Imworth, its keeper, fled to Westminster Abbey for sanctuary. But being known as a tormentor without pity, this was ignored. He was dragged out and made to pay in the mortuary. Lambeth Palace was targeted, then the Marshalsea prison, which held yet more victims of the draconian statute. It was emptied so those within could join the peasant army, in its aim to defeat all those prosecuting the destitute. From a turret in the tower, the king could see the rebel army, and hear the gale-force murmurings of its multitude. The flames and plumes of smoke which punctuated every horizon gave an indication of the crowd's hostile attitude. Panicked, the Earl of Salisbury said to the royal council, "If the rebels are successful, then it will be all over with us and our heirs, and England will be a desert," meaning that only his class should live in clover. On June the 14th, the king agreed to meet Tyler at Mile End, and was persuaded to accede to the people's demands, that feudal service should be abolished, along with market monopolies, and that bishops give up their power and their lands. According to Adam of Usk, a chronicler of the time, Tyler demanded the liberation of all prisoners, believing that tax commissioners who locked people up for debt were no more than extortionate swindlers. No man should serve another man, Tyler said, but by his own free will. The rebels now described themselves as the true commons, and were forming revolutionary councils, which, through open-air debate, worked out their demands, and after shows of hands settled on a charter, to spell out for the monarchist mafia ranged against them precisely what it was they were after. John Ball explained his socio-economic theory, plainly enough for anyone to understand. The lords claim to be more lords than we are, rests only on their power to force us to labour that they may spend. The feudal lords had fine wines and good food, he explained, thanks to the surplus value produced by their serfs. The lords then protected their property by law and by force, so they felt like giants and made others like dwarfs. The next day the king met the rebels again at Smithfield, now scared his whole kingdom would be demolished, for Tyler demanded all Englishmen should be treated equally, and that every aristocratic title should be abolished. Smithfield in those days was a large open space lying between Holborn River and Faggleswell Brook. St. Bart's Hospital and the Charterhouse, its other boarders, held a truculent crowd with a purposeful look. Wat Tyler was wearing a thick woolen hood on his head, which he kept on, rather than showing deference. Tyler gave no sign that he was overawed by the king, nor by the crown, which was the king's preference. An eyewitness, the writer John Gower, noted that Tyler had a nickname. The crowd called him the Jackdaw. So the Jackdaw stirred up all the others with his outrageous shouting, and he drew the people's minds towards war. Tyler was supported by Ball at his side in his monk's garb, who personally warned the king that matters cannot go well in England until all things shall be in common. The king's advisers saw their system in tatters. Particularly when the crowd took up John Ball's chant, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" and was being swayed by the priest's stirring rants. There are those in England who are treated as beasts, while others idle in velvet. But by whose leave? Why should they be more masters than we are of ourselves? Aren't we descended from the same parents, Adam and Eve? Much the worse shall it be for the lords of this realm, Tyler added, if this charter be refused. He described a vision of England, with self-governing communes, and with no one in the land or city being ill-used. No lord shall exercise lordship over the people, and, as we are oppressed by so vast a horde of bishops and clerks, the property of the Holy Church should be taken and divided. If there was to be no end to serfdom, then those benefiting from a callous feudal system would be attacked, and furthermore, they insisted, no man be compelled to work, except under a fairly agreed labour contract. How ill they behave to us! For what reason? Ball asked. For what reasons do they hold us in bondage? But at this moment, the Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, an influential member of the king's entourage, stepped forward to advise the king, and Walworth saw no reason why any concessions should be made. Walworth was benefiting from making loans to the crown for wars, something that was laying the City of London's foundations. For William Walworth and his tax-collecting cronies would blackmail the government of the day. Do what we want, or we sit on tax money and war loans. You'll be bankrupt, and the army will mutiny. Though Parliament had complained about this gang of plutocrats, Walworth, now War Treasurer, and his friends conspired to keep food prices up, and they persuaded the king to issue edicts that gave them the monopolies and the profits they desired. But Wat Tyler's idea of fair shares was anathema to Walworth, blasphemy to this courtier, brothel-keeper, and money-grubber, who, when he saw the king shake hands with a shoeless ruffian, suddenly saw red, and leapt at Tyler with his dagger. Like a coward, Mayor Walworth attacked Tyler from behind, stabbing him in the neck with his blade. Walworth set a pattern for the City of London's robber barons, self-serving cutthroats who work in the shade. Betrayed, the participants in the great rising returned home, only for the king to renege on his every concession, then send out troops to round up 500 farm labourers, grouping them together on a mass gallows as a lesson. At Smithfield, the king had given his word to Wat Tyler. All that you have asked for, I promise readily. And now let the people return, for their requests have been granted. But they would soon learn about royal hypocrisy. Tyler and the king had first of all met 1-to-1, but then courtiers and guards gathered round, so it was hard for the crowd to see what was happening, and they couldn't see Tyler fall to the ground. For fear of the crowd's reaction, the king then deceived them. He'd concealed that Tyler's life had now ended. "Tyler has been knighted," he called. "Your demands have been granted." But in fact Walworth was having Tyler's body beheaded. The king then instructed Walworth to protect the city. "You are to punish everyone who makes riots against our peace, either according to the law or by beheading and the mutilation of limbs, as seems to you most expeditious and sensible." And all the charters for the remission of servitude that he'd earlier signed, the treacherous king announced that he'd cancelled. The king's idea of utopia was of him alone on his throne, while the rest of the population cravenly grovelled. On a tour of Essex, the king sneered at his forlorn subjects. Though as a Christian they were supposed to be his brothers. Rustics you were, and rustics you are still. You will remain in bondage, not as before, but incomparably tougher.